Imagine waking up one day to find your homeland suddenly belongs to a foreign power. That's exactly what happened to Puerto Ricans in 1898. But how did the United States gain control of this Caribbean island? The answer involves a war, a treaty, and a series of decisions that would change the course of history. This is the story of how Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory, and why some call it theft. The year is 1897. Puerto Rico, a Spanish colony for over 400 years, has just been granted autonomy. The island's people are hopeful for a new era of self-governance, but their dreams are about to be shattered. Let's rewind a bit to understand the context. Puerto Rico, discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1493, had been under Spanish rule since 1508. For centuries, it served as a strategic military outpost and a hub for sugar production. The native Taino population was decimated by disease and forced labor, leading to the importation of African slaves. By the late 19th century, a distinct Puerto Rican identity had emerged. The island's people, a mix of indigenous, African, and European ancestry, had developed their own culture, language, and aspirations for self-rule. Bartolomé entered the United States. It's 1898, and tensions between the U.S. and Spain are at an all-time high. The reason? Cuba. The Cuban people are fighting for independence from Spain, and the U.S. decides to intervene. On April 25, 1898, the U.S. declares war on Spain. This conflict, known as the Spanish-American War, lasts just 3 months and 22 days, but its impact on Puerto Rico will last for generations. As part of its war strategy, the U.S. decides to invade Puerto Rico. On July 25th, American troops land on the island's southern coast. The invasion meets little resistance. Many Puerto Ricans, frustrated with Spanish rule, actually welcomed the Americans as liberators. The U.S. troops, led by General Nelson Miles, quickly advance across the island. Miles issues a proclamation promising to promote your prosperity and bestow the immunities and blessings of our enlightened institutions and government. These words would soon ring hollow for many Puerto Ricans. But here's where things get interesting. Just as the U.S. is making headway in Puerto Rico, the war comes to an abrupt end. Spain and the U.S. sign a ceasefire on August 12, 1898. Now, you might think this would mean the U.S. troops would pack up and leave, but that's not what happened. Instead, the U.S. and Spain entered into negotiations that would seal Puerto Rico's fate. These negotiations resulted in the Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898. This document officially ended the Spanish-American War, but it also did something else. It handed Puerto Rico over to the United States. That's right. Spain ceded Puerto Rico to the U.S. as war booty. The Puerto Rican people, who had been on the verge of autonomy just a year earlier, weren't even consulted. In fact, no Puerto Rican representatives were present at the treaty negotiations. So how did the U.S. justify this? They claimed it was for Puerto Rico's own good. The U.S. government argued that it could provide better governance and economic opportunities for the island. But let's look at the facts. The U.S. immediately imposed a military government on Puerto Rico. English became the official language of schools and courts, despite most Puerto Ricans speaking Spanish. U.S. corporations began buying up large tracts of land, pushing out local farmers. The shift in economic policy was dramatic. Under U.S. rule, Puerto Rico's diverse agricultural economy was transformed into a sugar monoculture. This benefited U.S. sugar companies but left the island vulnerable to economic fluctuations. In 1900, the U.S. Congress passed the Foraker Act. This law established a civilian government in Puerto Rico, but one controlled by U.S.-appointed officials. Puerto Ricans could elect their own House of Representatives, but the governor and other key positions were appointed by the U.S. president. The Foraker Act also established Puerto Rico as an unorganized territory. This meant that Puerto Rico belonged to the U.S. but was not part of it. Puerto Ricans were now Puerto Rican citizens, neither American citizens nor citizens of an independent nation. It wasn't until 1917 with the Jones-Shafroth Act that Puerto Ricans were granted U.S. citizenship, but even this came with a catch. The act also made it clear that Puerto Rico was an unincorporated territory of the U.S. This meant that not all parts of the U.S. Constitution applied to Puerto Rico. Critics argue that the granting of citizenship was not altruistic. It came just a month before the U.S. entered World War I, and Puerto Ricans could now be drafted into the U.S. military. Indeed, over 18,000 Puerto Ricans served in the World War I. So, was this theft? Many would argue yes. The U.S. took control of Puerto Rico without the consent of its people. It imposed its rule, its language, and its economic system on the island. The U.S. effectively replaced one colonial power with another. While Spain had granted Puerto Rico autonomy, the U.S. reversed this progress. Puerto Ricans found themselves with less self-governance than they had under Spanish rule in 1897. But others might argue that the U.S. brought modernization and economic development to Puerto Rico. They might point out that Puerto Ricans today have U.S. citizenship and receive federal benefits. The reality, as always, is complex. Puerto Rico's relationship with the U.S. has evolved over time. Today, Puerto Rico is a commonwealth of the United States. It has its own constitution and elected governor. But it's still not a state, and its people can't vote in U.S. presidential elections. The economic situation in Puerto Rico remains challenging. The island has a higher poverty rate than any U.S. state. Its infrastructure is aging, as dramatically illustrated by the devastation of Hurricane Maria in 2017 and the slow recovery that followed. Politically, Puerto Rico exists in a kind of limbo. It's not a sovereign nation, but it's not a U.S. state either. This status has significant implications. For example, Puerto Rico can't declare bankruptcy to restructure its debt as Detroit did in 2013. It also receives less federal funding for programs like Medicaid compared to U.S. states. The question of Puerto Rico's status remains a hot topic. Some Puerto Ricans want statehood, seeing it as a path to equal rights and representation. Others want independence, believing that Puerto Rico should be a sovereign nation. And still others prefer the current arrangement, fearing that change could lead to loss of cultural identity or economic instability. Several referendums have been held on Puerto Rico's status, with mixed results. The most recent, in 2020, showed a slim majority in favor of statehood. However, these referendums are non-binding, and any change in status would require action by the U.S. Congress. But one thing is clear. The way the U.S. acquired Puerto Rico in 1898 was far from democratic. It was a decision made by distant powers without regard for the wishes of the Puerto Rican people. The acquisition of Puerto Rico was part of a larger pattern of U.S. expansion at the turn of the 20th century. Along with Puerto Rico, the U.S. also gained control of Guam and the Philippines from Spain. This marked the beginning of the U.S. as a global imperial power. The story of Puerto Rico and the U.S. is far from over. As debates about colonialism, self-determination, and the nature of American democracy continue, Puerto Rico's status remains a powerful reminder of the complex legacies of past actions. What path will Puerto Rico choose, and how will the U.S. respond? The next chapter in this long and complicated history is yet to be written. What are your thoughts about it? Will Puerto Rico become the 51st state? Will it seek independence, or will it remain in this political limbo? Let us know in the comments section. For more such videos and hot topics, stay tuned to our channel and don't forget to subscribe.